Hey, this is Derek. Interesting too? Skepticality, the official audio program of Skeptic Magazine for Tuesday, June 19th, 2012.
Skepticality. Science!
Welcome back to another episode of Skepticality, the show that features interviews with skeptics, scientists, and people from all walks of life for the love and promotion of science. Well, before we get into the meat of this episode, I must give a huge thank you to all the people out there who've been helping support the show. People such as Chris Solendral, Mary Brown, Richard Cornford, and many others who've sent in donations which keep the lights on around our little studio here. There are many ways you can support the show, either via direct donation, or by purchasing our mobile applications, or just by going to the Skepticality.com website and clicking the little Amazon support box anytime you have the need to purchase anything in Amazon. Using that box helps us a tiny bit, and there's absolutely no extra charge to your shopping. So I'm going to stop with the panhandling portion of the show and get right over to Tim Farley, his look at the past and future of all things skeptical.
I'm Tim Farley of whatstheharm.net and skeptools.com, and this is Skepticism Past and Future. This month in the past, we've got a 25th, a 65th, and a 75th anniversary of key events relating to skepticism. And in the future, we've got skeptical slacktivism. First, the anniversaries. The day this podcast is being released is the 25th anniversary of a crucial court ruling on the teaching of evolution in the United States. Edwards v. Aguillard concerned a Louisiana law which mandated the teaching of creationism alongside evolution in schools. Lower courts had correctly ruled that this was a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, the so-called separation of church and state. But the state of Louisiana decided to take it to the top court in the land, and they did not succeed. The court ruled on June 19, 1987, that the lower courts were correct, dealing a legal death blow to creationism. This led to the development of intelligent design and other diversionary tactics, which continue to this day. This month is also the 65th anniversary of the UFO phenomenon in the United States. In the summer of 1947, several incidents in the western U.S. together started a craze that flying saucers were visiting the Earth. The most famous incident began when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing a string of 9 disc-like objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington on June 24, 1947. Just 3 days earlier, on June 21, 1947, at Maury Island near Tacoma, Washington, another alleged incident occurred. A seaman named Harold Dahl claimed to see 6 donut-shaped objects flying through the sky. Some sort of accident occurred, dropping debris on his boat and allegedly killing his dog. At various points since then, Dahl has admitted this was a hoax and then recanted that. And finally, the famous Roswell incident supposedly occurred in June and July 1947, with the U.S. Army making a public statement about recovered debris on July 8, 1947. Much of the legend of Roswell was built up years later by UFO enthusiasts. It was not well known at the time. It was actually the Kenneth Arnold incident that got the UFO ball rolling in 1947. Finally, July 2nd is the 75th anniversary of the last time aviator Amelia Earhart was heard from while on her round-the-world trip in 1937. Some sort of navigational or mechanical error led to tragedy, and neither Earhart, her navigator Fred Noonan, nor any trace of their airplane has ever been seen again. Many crackpot theories have emerged over the years. These include that Earhart was captured by the Japanese, or that she faked the whole thing, returning to the U.S. to live under an assumed name. I'm sure we'll be hearing more of these in this anniversary year. Celebrating round anniversaries such as the 25th or the 75th is always somewhat arbitrary. Why should we assign significance to these arbitrary numbers, I wonder? That leads me, in an oblique way, to my topic for the future this week. It is something I plan to cover in my upcoming workshop at the Amazing Meeting on Thursday, July 12th. It is the concept of slacktivism or clicktivism. These terms refer to the concept that some people claim to be involved in activism via the internet, but limit their involvement to what they can accomplish easily online, often with a single mouse click. For example, clicking like for a cause on Facebook, retweeting something on Twitter, signing petitions online, commenting on blogs or forums, changing your avatar to show solidarity, forwarding an email, and invading an online poll. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these activities. I certainly retweet things and click like on Facebook all the time. But when you get too focused on these digital activities and lose sight of your activist goal, you can end up wasting time on the wrong things. Your level of online activity can actually lull you into the false sense that you are accomplishing something when really you aren't. Let me give you an example. There are some prominent bloggers in the skeptic and atheist community who occasionally encourage their readers to bomb online polls. This is where you send everyone who reads your blog off to another site to vote in a poll in order to influence the results in the direction you prefer. In February, one such poll was put up by a site called budgettravel.com, and the horrible Creation Museum was being voted up by readers of creationist evangelist Ken Ham's website. Atheists rallied to vote for the other entries, and several angry opposing blog posts ensued. Thousands of votes poured in on both sides. In the end, the atheist effort failed, and the Creation Museum moved up in the poll, ending up at number 1. But guess what happened? Budget Travel issued their final article, and the Creation Museum was nowhere to be found. And several good science destinations were actually included. It was actually clearly stated in the original article that the editors intended to use the poll as a guide, not as the sole determiner of the final article. They even said that the vote counts were not going to matter very much. So the entire effort was basically a waste of time. Now, you could argue this was a community-building exercise, or it was just fun to make creationists angry, and some have done just that, and I get that. But I wonder what else could have been accomplished with all that effort. Now, don't get me wrong. Online activities can absolutely be a vital part of a larger effort, too. For example, last August, when the Twitter community rallied to get the Montreal police to do something about the David Maybus spam problem, retweeting and signing petitions were a key part of that. But those activities were backed up with a number of other ones, including gathering of evidence, phone calls, faxes, visits to the police station to file reports, and so on. Without these other components of the campaign, all the retweeting would have been for naught, because the goal was that a person who had made death threats be brought to justice. And we accomplished that. We accomplished that goal in part through online activism, but it took a lot more than just clicking. So the next time you're clicking like, or bombing a poll, or retweeting, think for a minute. What am I actually accomplishing here? Will this effort lead to something good, or is it just for my own amusement? In my upcoming workshop, I'm focusing on crowdsourcing projects that can have a real effect. I'm going to talk about how you can help create warnings about dangerous misinformation that can be seen by over 900 million users of Facebook and Web of Trust. I'm also going to show you how small efforts to edit Wikipedia can result in huge wins for skepticism, and much, much more. I hope you will join me at the Amazing Meeting, July 12th through 15th in Las Vegas. And this brings us to the end of another edition of Skepticism Past and Future. Links to additional material are in the show notes. And follow me on Twitter or Facebook under the name Krelnick, Krelnik, for a daily fact from Skepticism's past and ongoing news of Skepticism's future.
Thanks again, Tim. Have you purchased your tickets to the Amazing Meeting 2012 out in Las Vegas? Well, already have. So, if you're going to be there, make sure you come up and say hi to me and Tim. Tim will be running a workshop there at TAM, which I will be a part of. So you can come by and say hi not only to myself, but meet Tim and let him know how much you enjoy his segments on the show. So while you go and double check your travel plans, I'll let Bob Carroll give you another entry from his big dictionary of skeptical reference.
This is Bob Carroll, creator of the Skeptic's Dictionary and the blog Unnatural Acts That Can Improve Your Thinking. Welcome to another episode of Unnatural Virtue. In this and future episodes, I'll be offering some brief comments on topics in critical thinking, skepticism, and science. Today's topic is self-deception. Study after study has found that the vast majority of people think they are above average, less biased, more congenial, less susceptible to improper influence, and more competent than the majority of their peers. 94% of university professors think they are better at their jobs than their colleagues. 70% of college students think they are above average in leadership ability. Only 2% of college students think they are below average in leadership ability. 25% of college students believe they're in the top 1% in terms of their ability to get along with others. 85% of medical students think it's improper for politicians to accept gifts from lobbyists, but only 46% of medical students think it's improper for physicians to accept gifts from drug companies. A study of medical residents found that 84% thought that their colleagues were influenced by gifts from pharmaceutical companies, but only 16% thought that they were similarly influenced. Most people believe that those who agree with them on issues they consider important are high-minded, diligent, and keen observers of the human condition, while those who disagree with them are biased, sloppy thinkers acting on selfish motives with little concern for the truth. Self-deception is natural and pervasive, and while it may sometimes provide a boost to our sense of well-being to have an exaggerated opinion of our abilities or characteristics, self-deception is probably always detrimental to critical thinking. Those who consider themselves immune to cognitive biases, while supposing all their opponents are biased and ill-motivated, are not likely to be corrected of any errors they maintain. Those who think they are immune to the effects of bribes, while their colleagues are not, are likely to deceive themselves into thinking they are acting properly, when in fact their behavior crosses the line into immorality. Those who think they are immune to flattery and appeals to their vanity are likely to be suckered into taking actions they will later regret. The human brain evolved to be a great deceiver. One of the most common deceptions we face is thinking we see patterns and meaning in random events or coincidences. We like to fit our perceptions into a running narrative that holds our worldview together, whatever that worldview might be. Because of this natural tendency to confirm our biases and disconfirm beliefs that conflict with our beliefs, science has developed methods such as the double-blind randomized control group study to minimize self-deception. The likelihood of self-deception increases for those who give greater weight to the evidence from personal experience than they do to the evidence from scientific studies. Does this mean that scientists are free from self-deception? Of course not. Scientists can unconsciously bias experiments to confirm their beliefs, while convincing themselves that they are unbiased and objective. Experimenters can unconsciously influence human subjects with their expectations and biases, and thereby skew their data to favor a treasured hypothesis. One of the more famous examples of self-deception by a scientist is that of the French physicist René Blondeau, who thought he had discovered a new form of radiation. He named it the In-ray, after his university and hometown of Nantes. The In-ray was a delusion, however. Actually, it was a self-induced visual hallucination, as Martin Gardner noted. Recent examples of self-deception in science have been provided by Pons and Fleischmann, who claim to have produced energy from cold fusion, and Jacques Benveniste, who claimed to have proof that water in homeopathic potions has selective memory. There are numerous ways that scientists can deceive themselves about their objectivity and fairness in designing and evaluating experiments. One common way that many scientists deceive themselves is in the way that they use statistics. Many spirit or parascientists, those who study ESP, psychokinesis, distance healing with chants or prayers, homeopathy, and the like, have deceived themselves in regarding the value of statistical significance and meta-analysis. They assume that if the data from a single study show results unlikely due to chance according to some arbitrary mathematical formula, that they have found convincing evidence for their hypothesis. Or they lump together the data from several small studies and apply an arbitrary statistical formula to the data as if it were collected from a single larger study. If they find statistical significance, they think they found strong evidence for their beliefs. Unlike those who rely solely on personal experience for a guide, however, scientists have other scientists who criticize their work and who publish their criticisms in peer-reviewed journals, at public meetings, and in the mass media. Personal biases are easier to reinforce by associating with people who share your biases and by distancing yourself from those you disagree with. Scientists can do this too, but it is much more difficult for a self-deceived scientist to get away with his or her deceptions, since science is essentially self-correcting over the long haul. Science, as Jacob Bronowski put it, is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. Self-deception encrusts the worldviews of the arrogant, whether they be highly intelligent or simply incompetent. Highly intelligent people who are arrogant are capable of fending off any counter-evidence to their beliefs. These are the folks described by Michael Shermer in his attempt to explain why some smart people believe dumb things. They are the great rationalizers. At the other extreme are those who are incompetent. They're incapable of recognizing their erroneous judgments. The incompetent are not necessarily stupid. Often enough they are of average intelligence, but lack knowledge and experience relevant to understanding how self-deception works and how we are all susceptible to many cognitive illusions and biases. So, even though it might be true that if we were too brutally honest and objective about our own abilities and about life in general, we might become debilitated by depression, we should not forget that there is a dark side to self-deception. Our ability to think critically depends on our ability to overcome the many biases that lead us to self-deception. Well, that's it for this episode of Unnatural Virtue. For more on cognitive biases and how they deceive us, check out my blog Unnatural Acts That Can Improve Your Thinking, or follow the links on the page in the Skeptic's Dictionary entitled Hidden Persuaders. In the meantime, please commit some unnatural acts in public, and don't forget, skepticism, though unnatural, is a virtue.
Once again, I have to thank Bob for sharing the work he does over the Skeptic's Dictionary with all of us here at Skepticality. Another pile of people I have to thank would be Wendy, Jarrett, and the crew, who deal with chances, which some would consider, well, insane.
Hello, and welcome to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality, where we happily listen to your story about the crazy thing that happened to you that one time, then try to apply cold, hard statistics to it. I'm Wendy Hughes.
And I'm Jarrett Kaufman.
And we're here to tell you a fun story and some facts about it, all while alternating between our two co-hosts so you never get the chance to get sick of either of us.
Hi, Wendy. So what's in the pipe for today's story?
Hi, Jarrett. Today's submission comes from friend of the blog, Allison Smith. It's debuting here and on our blog simultaneously under the name God and Pizza in Vermont, which you can search for on the site or click on in the show notes. Allison's story begins.
My friend Jeff Wag and I both worked at the James Randi Educational Foundation for some time. We were close enough that we often had yelled debates over the phone, and the most popular conversation between us was about a higher power. Unlike many of my friends in the critical thinking world, I am not an atheist, though characterizing my form of belief is rather difficult. One day, Jeff and I were winding down from one of these debates, and, tired of the argument, Jeff said, "I would believe in God if pizza showed up on my doorstep." I should add that he insists he said a pizza. Immediately, I began to plan. Jeff lived in the middle of nowhere in Vermont. Pizza places didn't deliver to him, and the nearest restaurant was something like half an hour away. I, at the time, lived in Texas, so I couldn't shuttle a pizza over either. But we did have a mutual friend in New Hampshire, one that was driving over to visit Jeff soon, and she was the nice sort of person who would do a favor if I asked. I called her and asked that, along the way, she stop off and get pizza to take to Jeff. I didn't tell her the reason or the source of the issue. I am not sure, even now, if she knew at the time that I wasn't an atheist. She did agree to get the pizza, and I sat back like a villain in a comic book with a bit of maniacal laughter. On the way to Jeff's house, our friend stopped off to get the pizza, and while there saw a greeting card she liked. She bought it, wrote in it, and added it to the pizza to take to Jeff. He opened it and was amazed. So am I, even still. The front of the card was the painting, The Creation of Adam, where God is reaching out to Adam, and Adam is reaching back. However, in this interpretation, their hands were not empty. God held out a pizza, and Adam held out money. On the inside, our friend wrote, "And God said, 'Let there be pizza.'" Jeff is still an atheist, though, because our friend didn't get him a pizza, as he claims he said. She got slices. Go figure.
This is one of the funniest and seemingly most entertaining stories we've gotten in quite some time, and we all had a good laugh when Allison sent it in. We tried to imagine the look on Jeff's face when he saw the card, but with a story this great, we just had to pass it along to Barbara Drescher, a resident balloon popper. We're kidding, Barbara, we love you, to share her thoughts, which we'll paraphrase here for you. As usual, visit this story on our site for her unedited text. Barbara says,
As cute, funny, and amazing as the story is, the amazing part does not hold up to scrutiny. The author notes that arguments about the existence of God were common between her and Jeff. It's likely that Jeff had discussions about religion with others as well. Given that the woman who visited Jeff is a mutual friend, the odds are pretty good that the friend was an atheist or at least enjoyed discussions about religion herself. When she saw the card, she knew that Jeff would appreciate that humor, and the fact that she was bringing him pizza made the card even funnier, even though she did not know that the pizza had anything to do with a discussion about God.
Barbara further explains, this is a case in which mutual interests and values are responsible for the friendships the three shared, making the odds of something like this happening much greater than they appear. Great story, but not crazy odds.
Even with these elements that Barbara accounts for, I'd still like to add in the inexplicability that this restaurant would even have a card like this. I suppose if a pizza place is going to carry cards at all, I've never seen this, they might as well be pizza-themed, but it just feels like an extra surprising element.
We also got a kick out of Allison's clever prank. In a world where arguments over religion often lead to the worst results, we were happy to see two people with different views on the subject able to handle the situation so maturely.
And by mature, we mean a variation on the old sending someone a pizza they didn't order prank. Okay, fine, maybe mature was the wrong word.
Thanks for listening to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality. Please be sure to visit theoddsmustbecrazy.com and give us your feedback, comments, and unbridled adoration. Or at least pick two.
Also be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, circle us on Google+, and validate us in life. Hit the Submit a Story link on our site to share your own crazy stories, or tweet the short ones with the hashtag TOMBC.
The Odds Must Be Crazy is a project in collaboration with the Independent Investigations Group in Los Angeles, California. Visit them at iigwest.org. Barbara Drescher is a contributing editor to our blog and can also be found at icbseverywhere.com. Special thanks to our producer and audio engineer, Brian Hart. Our theme music comes to us courtesy of Mr. Deity himself, Brian Keith Dalton. You can find him at mrdeity.com.
And until next time, remember this old piece of advice. Every time God closes a window, he sends you a pizza.
Wait, that's not what it says.
Thanks again to Wendy and the crew over there at IIGA West, and the Gods Must Be Crazy, for taking their time to send us some of their best user-submitted content from the website. A few days ago, I had the pleasure of sitting down to talk with Michael McRae, a science writer and promoter who lives in Australia. Mike put out a book, Tribal Science, back in 2011. However, this book has only just been published over here in the United States, where I live. I was lucky enough to have had a copy of this book for quite a while now. And in fact, when it went to print here in the United States, the publisher gave me the honor of submitting a short quote for the back cover of the book. Tribal Science is a great look at science and critical thinking. It sheds light into the corners of the issues we all think about from day to day. So, Michael, I got you up. You don't know it's late there. It's early here.
20 past 11 in the evening here. Yep.
Yeah. So you're actually, people always have that whole thing about we'll dig a hole to China. You're pretty much exactly in that same ballpark. Because if I dug a hole, I'd be pretty much where you live now. So
you might have to dogleg a little bit, but I think it's pretty much on the other side of the planet. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. So I have you on because you have a new book coming out, or it just came out. I think it just came out, or coming up soon.
Yeah, it's come out in the US. I think it was early May, so it's actually available on Amazon now and in a number of bookstores in the US. Yeah,
I've had a copy for a while now, but so to me, I never remember when the book actually comes out. So your new book is Tribal Science. Tell people a little bit about what the book's general topic is.
The general idea behind it came because years ago when I guess I started getting into skepticism, I really wanted to understand what it was that drove people to form beliefs. It wasn't enough for me to just sort of understand that they did and that I wanted to convince people how to change what they believe or to be more critical or more skeptical. I really wanted to understand what it was that drove people to learn. And so I guess over the years I've thrown myself into that and have developed an appreciation for how people learn collectively. We're all social animals. We evolved brains that aren't really these magical things. And I think sometimes we fall for this idea that some people are more enlightened in a very, for lack of a better word, mystical kind of way. The brain just operates by magical principles. It doesn't. It's like an organ like anything else. It's a bunch of cells that operates on a very biomechanical basis, biochemical basis. And because of that, I sort of feel that there are still going to be principles at work that drive us to believe things in certain ways. And I think by looking at our evolution and seeing why the brain evolved can tell us a lot about how we form beliefs. And so that's where the origin of tribal science basically came from. Several years ago, I gave a lecture in Brisbane on pseudoscience. And so I had all these notes there on pseudoscience and how the brain evolved and why it is that we actually think scientifically and how it is, where does pseudoscience come from? And I took those notes and just built them up into something a little bit bigger. And tribal science is what came out of that. So I basically wanted something, though, that connected not so much with people who are already into this sort of stuff, already into critical thinking and skepticism and science. I tend to find there's two things. One, people who tend to already be interested in science at that level feel they already understand things in a certain way, and so they don't want to be retold. But then you get a lot of people, I think, who kind of still need to understand aspects of the brain, how it works, why is it that science works so well, what are its limitations. And I wanted to try to address them, which is why I think my background in writing for children and writing for the general public and just using a lot of storytelling, I wanted to bring that into it. And so Tribal Science is a whole collection of stories and anecdotes about history that pretty much explains how it is that the brain works in terms of doing science. So it's science as a cultural thing rather than as a pure ideology. Now, your work during, they call it, quote unquote, your day job, you're an educator, right? Technically I'm a science writer currently. So I started off many years ago I was in pathology, so I was a medical scientist, then went into being a teacher. And about half a dozen years ago, I went into science communication. So these days I actually produce educational resources for the CSIRO, which is a research organisation in Australia. So really lucky to actually work for their education department and produce educational materials for various groups there, primarily for their publications section.
Now, you mentioned that this book is mainly for people who usually don't get books like this.
Yeah, well, that was the aim. I know a lot of writers always have either a wide audience in mind or a very specific person. I had a very small audience in mind, and that was I grew up very working class, and I guess it was people who, part of my family and part of my background, people who don't necessarily think of themselves as being scientifically literate. These aren't people who went to university and came out with degrees. These are people who, are intelligent but don't consider themselves to be part of the scientific community. So I sort of thought I wanted to write something for my family who would then read that and think, there's some interesting stories here, and they learn something about how science works out of that. And from the feedback I've had, it seems to be that lighthearted, that sort of easy read sort of book. And so I feel I've succeeded in that way, in trying to actually get people who wouldn't normally read these sort of books to get something that, I think the best compliment I had was compared to Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, except it was a lot easier to read. So it was a lot lighter to read in many ways. And that to me was the best. It was just like I must have hit the nail on the head with some people if they feel that was the case.
Yeah, it's kind of it is a journey, though, in a way. It's from like way back when we were cave people in the book to pretty much where we are now. And you outline a lot of things in the book that skeptic people or scientific people always talk about. But it's funny that when you actually read the stories you put in here, I think that science-minded people have glommed on to so many parts of science, and they understand what the basis of them are. But in your book, I think the one thing about this book that some of the, highly educated in science or skeptical thought are that they would actually get from this book are some of the background that you put in here that they don't really think about. Like, you have a whole story about Occam's razor that I think most people don't even know about. And, things like that I think are pretty valuable because history, is one of those things that a lot of people dismiss in a way in general during the day. And I think
we do, we feel we're at the very enlightened part of history, and I think that's just one of those natural things that comes out of the way we think. We sort of think this is it, we've made it to the pinnacle of science, but we don't actually think about how it is that science is an evolving culture. And that was the one thing I found fascinating. The one question I always had for ages until I really sat down and tried to work it out and did a lot of reading on it was, why is it for so long we've had brains that have worked the way they've had? For tens of thousands of years or long, we've had brains that anatomically are kind of as they are today. And yet science itself, at an absolute push, you might be able to say the philosophy goes back, 2.5 millennia. And that's pretty much it. There may have been earlier examples, but for what we can connect with, nothing has survived from before 2,500 years ago. And something happened then in a very particular place on the planet which caused culture that we now call science or scientific philosophy. It emerged there, and I always wanted to know, why was it that for so long we thought the way we did, and there was some sort of a spark, this revolution that meant we now think about things a little bit differently. And it showed just how cultural science is. It's not something that just naturally emerges out of the way we think. It really is a product, I think, of a whole lot of these little tiny cultural quirks that works, that actually gives us a pragmatic way of understanding nature, that allows us to control our surroundings in certain ways. But it's an evolution itself. It is something that is constantly changing as we go ahead. And I think we take that for granted sometimes. I think a lot of rationalists seem to think of it as a natural consequence of the way our brains work. It is the enlightened way. Without thinking, it's a very particular cultural quirk that basically gives us this ability to think scientifically.
Yeah, it's like some of those anecdotes you put on the book were just fun to think about. Like I said before, the Occam's razor. All the science-based people talk about it all the time. But if you actually learn about where it comes from, a very religious person, it's kind of funny when you think about it.
Yeah, the whole idea that you can reduce everything down to as long as you accept that God exists, that's a given, and then we just cut away all the rest of the assumptions. But it's interesting that may be the origin of the concept of Occam's razor, but it itself has been a tool that's evolved over time. I do fear sometimes that we take for granted these little tools, these little bite-sized bits of information, and we don't chew on them. We don't think about them too much. So Occam's razor is often referred to as the simplest way of explaining something is often the best or most accurate. And I do wince a little bit at that. I sort of think, well, now you've got a problem with how do you explain simplicity. And that, philosophically, can be a bit of a challenge. So I tend to, when I actually teach about Occam's razor, instead I refer to it as an economy of assumptions. So anytime that you have to make an assumption on something that you can't validate in some way, each one of those has a high probability or a high possibility of being wrong. You don't have a real measure of that, and so you can just simply say, look, every time I make an assumption, there's as good a chance it's going to be wrong as it is going to be right. I'm guessing. So all these assumptions that you're making, that the more you make, the greater chance you might actually be wrong. So it's an economy trying to limit those assumptions. And that's what Occam's razor basically is why it's so valuable, is the fact that you're trying to say, make the fewest assumptions possible, because each time you do that, then really you're gambling on being wrong. But when you start introducing terms like simplicity, people get tripped up on that sort of thing. And that's where I think it's almost a shame that in this day and age, we're stepping away from science philosophy in many ways. I mean, you've had renowned physicists, like Stephen Hawking and, was it Lawrence Krauss recently as well, kind of saying we are now in the age of science and we've left philosophy behind. And yet I think there's a danger in that. We're no longer really expressing, I guess, the need to look philosophically at science and say, why is this such a useful system? Where are its flaws? Where are its uses? How is it going to evolve into the future? And I think by looking at that philosophy and understanding where it came from, I think we get a better appreciation on how to communicate it. I've lost count the number of times that people have, science communicators, people who are pushing the scientific agenda saying we really need to be out there and communicating this, get things like, facts and values mixed up, or, they can't really articulate what a theory really is. And when you get that language mixed up and you're not really looking at the philosophy behind it, and you're just trying to sell a very simple bite-sized message, I think that's where you get a lot of pseudoscience coming out of it. People who want to miscommunicate or who have other beliefs can very easily justify them when they've actually abused science in a particular way. So I think it's an important thing to keep that philosophy up front and understand that, and look at the history and look at where it's all come from to have a better appreciation, rather than just simply selling what you feel is the message.
Well, people always tend to forget that science came from philosophy. So if you trace it all the way back, and if you miss that part, I think you have a danger of repeating a lot of mistakes.
You draw the line between science and philosophy, and I've had so many wonderful conversations about how to actually distinguish them. And there's no simple answer. I mean, you've got the demarcation problem in science is how do you really identify what science is and what it's not? I gave a talk, actually it was just last year, on that very topic, on what is the difference between science and philosophy. And I basically said, well, they're the exact same thing, and they're not. It depends on how you interpret each of them in a cultural sort of perspective. So in some ways, if you look at philosophy, the bottom line of what philosophy is it's saying two people are putting forward ideas and they need some way to evaluate whose idea has some sort of merit. And so you have a system there to say, well, I've thought of this idea by, using these sort of thinking tools. And someone else will look at the idea and go, yeah, but you didn't use this thinking tool there, therefore my confidence in your idea goes down. And that's really the history of philosophy. It's come down to throwing out these ideas and discussing what merit they have based on the tools that have been applied to them. And over time, we've just come out with all these different tools. So we've had like experimentation, or we've had, various ways of blinding, for instance. You go back to Benjamin Franklin and, looking at, Antoine Mesmer and, coming up with a way of actually blinding people to their own biases. They're all ways of basically saying, here's my idea and here's how I want to measure it and evaluate it. So science is, in that respect, no different to philosophy. It's, we might have more tools today, but it's a gradual evolution over time where you can't set any point, look, here's where science suddenly came into its own. But by the same token, we can actually identify a period where something akin to what science is today came into its own, and that is that there was a particular period where certain philosophical tools became pragmatic. They became so useful that people could bank on them. They weren't just things to chew on anymore and go, that's an interesting idea. They became so useful and so accurate that people said, well, I've got a heap of money and I will use the information that's come out of that, or will use the tools and technology to invest that back into what I'm doing. And so you then had competition and trade, and you had military applications, and you had suddenly something that was so useful and so pragmatic. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise anymore. It actually had weight. So what we've then got is philosophy being married with authority. And I think now in the 20th century, we're in a really interesting time where we've got a lot of people who are accused of being anti-science. And I think we need to be careful in looking at, really, it's an anti-particular culture. I don't think anyone really can be called anti-science overall and in general. I think that what it is particular people have very particular beliefs that they don't like, they don't support, that clash with their cultural values, and so they will turn against. And they'll say, well, I like all this sort of science over here, but these ones over here clash with what I believe in. And so it's like, well, I'm going to find ways to say vaccination is wrong, or I'm going to find ways of saying, the globe isn't warming whatsoever. That clashes with these other values, and I'm not comfortable with that. So really, we've got a particular opposition to an authority, or to a position in science as cultural, and saying, well, I don't belong to that culture, so I'm going to stand against it. So we're going to be careful of really saying that that's anti-science. I think we've got to understand that science comes from a particular culture, and the best way to get beyond that is to start promoting science as a philosophy and as a democracy, and getting that conversation happening, rather than saying science is something I give to you as an authority.
It's kind of interesting because in your book, you actually outline a lot of these issues as the narrative goes along from the Stone Age man until today. And it's funny because I've had many other people on, especially people like Randy Olson on our show, and we've talked about this same issue when it comes down to communicating science across the non-science-minded people to the people who actually embrace science, even if they're not scientists. And it's hard. It's a hard road, and you outline a lot of it in the book, and it's a common thread I keep finding in today's scientific writing, is that that's the biggest bridge we have now, is that what do we do about the people we always claim are anti-science, what are they? They're anti-specific areas of science, I guess, or, anti-certain facts. It's very difficult to bridge the gap and get the education to those people. And, Carl Sagan's biggest drive was to do that same thing, and he got, ostracized from his peers because he actually was communicating out to the general population. And I think the feeling I get with most scientists these days is that we have to fix that, even though we have many who don't care. It's not that they're against it now. They have a lot that just don't care. They just want to do their job and be left alone. And I think what you said there is pretty telling, because I call people anti-science all the time. And it's funny when you put it that way, you're pretty much saying what I'm trying to say, but I just go to the dumbed down, version by saying they're anti-science. But there's probably a better way to say that. It's just soundbite society makes it hard.
Well, it is hard finding the right language to discuss a lot of these things, because this goes back, I guess, to that core concept I was saying before, and that is our brains are evolved organs. There is nothing perfect about it operating and understanding the universe. And they evolved to do something pretty specific, and that was to operate really well in social groups. Everything that's evolved about it, the intelligence that we have, the way of seeing things, is pretty much representing the universe in a symbolic way, so we can then share that information with others to build social groups. Now, there's some pretty useful little quirks in that, but the bottom line is, we didn't evolve it to understand anything about vaccination. It didn't evolve to understand, things about nanotechnology or genetic modification or any of that sort of stuff. They're just interesting consequences of the fact that really our brains evolved to operate as social beings, really, or as social animals. And so it's going to have a lot of little things that we will not be able to get past, unless we actually change the way that the brain operates. If we change it by building computers that can sort of think almost like humans but differently, well, that's cool, but they're not going to be human anymore. So really, the very fact we have brains that operate the way that they do means we're going to have limitations. And I think one of the things we're going to just have to accept is the fact that pseudoscience is always going to be around. They're always going to have people who have beliefs that really don't match our own. We just got to accept that. Religion is always going to have certain aspects of it that are going to exist. There's always going to be metaphysical senses of, there being more. There's always going to be that connection with something bigger. There's always going to be ritual. All those things, they'll come and go in different ways, but they're always going to exist because that's kind of things that come out of the way our brain actually works, and we've just got to get past that. I think once we've done that, there's a little bit of tolerance that we're going to have for ideas that just don't mirror our own. So what we come down to is, well, what do we really value? Do we really value, a sense of kind of feeling as if they've got a life that they want to live? Do we want to give people those values without them impinging on others? So a very liberal way of seeing things. Or do I really care that somebody else doesn't share my belief? And I think sometimes it's easy to get them confused. I mean, I feel it myself. I know this, having written that book, and I will still go out there and go, God, there's some dumbass people out there who believe in the craziest shit. And, and I'll go down to the pub and have a bit of a whinge and a whine about some of the mad-ass stuff that people believe in. I'm saying that because I hear those beliefs and they conflict with what I believe in. They don't define me. They define an other. They define another group that I don't belong to. And my identity will be compared to that. And I can sit and analyze it, but at the end of the day, I feel a conflict. And I come out and share with people who I associate in my tribe, in my group. I want to share that with them because it makes me feel good. It's identifying the difference between that feeling good and sitting there and just having a bit of a whine with some of your friends going, God, some people are so stupid, and actively going out there and doing something that creates, I guess, or achieves those values I really want. Now, for me, I was at an interesting meeting the other night with some Australian science communicators, and we're just discussing the sort of things that are going on in the science communication industry in Australia at the moment. And one of the things I mentioned there is that a lot of SciComm seems to be little different than religious evangelism. You can imagine I got a few frowns at that one. But what I was meaning was the fact that in both cases, the driving force of people is so others feel what they feel. If you imagine you're a Christian evangelist, you want to go out there and go, I feel fantastic because I've let Jesus into my heart. And other people go, what the hell are you on about? No, I feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. I feel amazing. I want you to feel that too. You just let Jesus into your heart, and here's all the wonderful things, and you'll have a great life like I've got. And you think we do that sometimes in SciComm. We go out there and say, science is amazing. The curiosity that was satisfying. I want other people to feel that sense of wonder that I feel when I get out there in the universe. And there's a driving force that's identical between them, and that is sometimes you feel that passion that you have is so wonderful you want to share it with others. You want to connect. You want other people to share your values. You want other people to share your way of seeing things. And I think, well, if that's it, if that's the only difference between me and an evangelist, well, why do I care that they're out there? It's not the only difference. For me, there's something very important about science, and that is it is the most way of discussing an idea. All that history of philosophy, the history of science, have given me a whole bunch of tools that I can sit there and take an idea and say, look, here's my perspective, but it is biased. It comes from a fragile brain that didn't evolve to do any of this sort of stuff. It evolved to do something completely different. So do your ideas, by the way. If it's personal, somebody has a different idea to mine. We've both got different ideas. How are we going to find a way to test them that is as objective as possible, that stands outside of what we are talking about here and evaluates it according to standards that neither one of us can affect? We've blinded ourselves, we've experimented, we're trying to gain confidence in whose idea is best. So I think when we live in a pluralistic community where a lot of people have different beliefs and different cultures and different backgrounds, science to me is a really good way to kind of say, how are we going to get confidence in an objective idea? But it's all well and good to say that. But it's still because of the fact that I still have a culture that's science. I still have all those things that are affecting me, that, that same love of science, that same belief system, that same inherited authority, this hegemony or this idea that there is a dominant culture there that basically starts through education, through medicine, a particular way of seeing things. I'm still part of that. And trying to distinguish them and trying to communicate that is a real challenge, I think. I think it's pursuing, not just because I like science, but because I think that's the best way to have a pluralistic community. But it also takes, I think, the other side, and that's a lot of tolerance. And that's saying, if you've got a bit of a crazy idea, that's okay until it starts impinging on what other people, they're right to have crazy ideas, I think. And that's where you have to have that value of discussion.
I wonder if a lot of this really comes ahead when you think about the fact that many of the societies where science is a big deal are also democracies where people vote for their leaders. And I think that actually creates a lot more tension than the underlined idea of science would usually bring. I mean, most people wouldn't care about a crazy idea if it wasn't for the fact that their crazy idea could affect millions of people.
Absolutely. And then that's the big thing there, is that whole idea of who has the resources to be identifying the problems that need solving. And I think that can be invisible sometimes. People really don't like it when I start to question things like, well, what does it matter if someone has a long life or not? If their value is, I want to die at an early age, who are you then to go, oh, you must be a bit crazy? We got this medicalization issue in the West where if somebody wants to commit euthanasia, they're sick, they don't want to exist anymore, well, there must be something wrong with them. So we tend to actually give them a condition. We say they're mentally unfit in some way. We got this way of saying, if you don't actually adhere to the values I've got, well, there must be something that's wrong with your head. And so you just aren't enlightened or at this peak of human existence as I am, you're deficient in some way. We can medicate that or we can address that in some way. So we've got this standard that we live to, which kind of says to be rational, to be scientific, you are at this level. Which means we've already identified what the problems are that need solving without thinking, well, maybe other cultures have different sets of problems. Maybe they don't see certain problems that they have. I'm actually doing my master's at the moment in medical anthropology, so the culture of health and medicine. And it's really been quite eye-opening for me just in terms of how much we assume a state of well-being. We sort of just think, well, well-being is something that everyone aspires to and it has to be identical for everyone. And by and large, most of it is. But there's going to be these little grey areas where we just sort of think, well, this is what actually marks a value in terms of health or well-being or desires for whatever it is. And so when you have science or a particular group of people who have the education and resources and the means to apply science to a particular problem, they're also identifying what that problem is for everybody else. And I think, again, the important thing is getting out there with all the different parts of the community, all the different tribes, subcultures, to understand how science works, to be part of that conversation and kind of say, well, you might think that that's a problem. Here's our voice, in the very least, to say, well, here's problems we have, or we don't identify with that. That doesn't mean we're going to get a perfect, cohesive society coming out of that. Not everyone is going to agree on the end result. But I think it's a lot better to have that conversation and have people feel as if they're engaged with science rather than having science imposed upon them and they reject it simply because it's not part of their culture.
And I get that feeling from people all the time when I argue with anybody about global warming. And I think that's exactly what I feel when I hear their arguments, what you're talking about right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big issues with global warming that, because one of the resources I've written for the CSRO was a sustainability education program. So basically looking at schools and creating education resources about climate change for primary schools and early secondary schools. And the amazing thing is getting out there and talking to teachers and students, all about this sort of, about global warming, climate change. And there's a lot of fear. A lot of kids really have this fear that, the end of the world is coming, or that, the world is going to end. And it's hard communicating, kind of saying the world's going to change. And that change is going to be for future generations. Maybe even you in your later years are going to experience something a lot more dramatically, a lot more different to what we've got now. But that's that's not really the big issue. In Australia, we're not going to have big problems with as a result of climate change. I'll tell you why, and that is because we've got resources. That means as time goes on and it becomes more and more dramatic, there's going to be certain consequences, which means that we'll deal with it. It's going to be hard, but by and large, we'll deal with the things that come up. Not all countries have resources to adapt and to deal with the effects of climate change. And that's where you get the problem is you've actually got a lot of countries that just don't have the means to be able to deal with it, and they will have massive food shortages. There'll be water supplies that just won't exist anymore, or the opposite, they'll actually have great changes in their ecosystems with the resources they're relying on that just won't exist anymore, and their culture has to change that dramatically that there's going to be suffering that we won't have in other countries because we'll hopefully have the resources to deal with that, to absorb some of it. And so what it really comes down to is not so much are you going to grow up and not have a planet to live on. It's going to be as you grow up, you're going to be engaged with these resources. You will have a say in what resources get devoted to what, not just for yourself, but how that, as a global community, how is that going to impact on others? And how are they in turn? How is that going to impact on you in the future? So it's going to be connected with people that you don't know yet. You don't know these people in other countries. You don't know the next generation that's coming along or the one after that. So you don't have that direct connection with them in I guess, a very socialist way, I guess. So when you're looking out for you and yours, and you're looking at the economy now, you're thinking, geez, they're taking, Australia will get the carbon tax coming up. And there's very much a culture of enlightenment entitlement with that, which says, well, I'm entitled to this money I've got now. Why are they taking it away from me? So they'll actually, create resources that'll hopefully help us mitigate and adapt to climate change for people that I don't even know. And so we've got this disconnect, I think, with other tribes, with other communities, with other people around the world. And that's where the problem with climate change comes into it. You're saying, how do you give people that value? How do you encourage them to have that value in kind of caring about what happens to other people? And that's a tricky thing to do in and of itself. And I think a lot of people deal with that by simply saying, well, I don't want to deal with that. That is something that is for others to deal with. It's not that bad. Science doesn't know everything. Science is wrong on this. Mathematical models are wrong when it comes to this. And so it's a little bit of, an ostrich sticking its head in the sand, simply so it doesn't have to deal with the complexities of those issues. And I think we've still got a fair way to go when it comes to discussing that, because it really does mean making that value of saying, well, these things are happening. It's something that you have to connect with other communities who really are going to be suffering for this in the future. And you do maybe to reduce the suffering that way, you're going to have to actually give up some of your resources.
It's funny because you talk about the communication between the tribes, and it wasn't until about 1995, not that long ago, before most people would ever know anybody outside their country. And now we are connected. I mean, I would never be able to talk to you like I am now, just 8 years ago. So you think about it and how far forward we've come and how many more problems that seems to have created. Because if you think about this in certain ways, there was pretty big global environmental issues we've had to deal with in the past. But when it was just the leaders of the countries and all we had was the nightly news, most people didn't care. And they just happened. And they fixed it. And we don't have much of a problem with the ozone hole anymore. We don't have the problem with, many other things. And when you had, educated people, then without the dinner table discussions and nightly news and 24-hour news cycle, it's funny how different it's become. It's great that we all get involved in and we all get, knowledge about these things. But then again, now we have to deal with now that we've communicated these issues to people, now how we have to fix the communication because they don't understand. And I think that's a huge, huge thing. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of times gets missed in the realm of the how do we scientifically communicate. Well, I'm not sure. It's not more about communicating the science. It's how to communicate the science and how it affects people. Because I think that's the second part that people don't really do.
It's one of those things I've thought a lot about in terms of the internet and the level of communication we have today, and I've come to the conclusion I really have absolutely no idea. I don't know how it's going to continue to affect our communication as a species. I've sort of swung both ways. On one side, I've sort of thought the level of communication we have, this tribalism that we have when it comes to the internet, and we're so connected that I can, as you said, people from vast distances and different cultures can actually come together and sympathize and communicate. You look at Twitter, and you can have these Twitter feeds where someone I don't know in the Middle East can be saying, this is happening in my backyard, and I think, wow, this is direct communication here. This isn't a journalist picking it. This is me looking at what they've written and going, wow, that kind of sucks. You could be one of my friends who was having your village bombed. So on one level, there is this new way of connecting with different people from different backgrounds and with different ideas all over the place. Yet by the same token, you actually see how a lot of it works, and we still seem to be just creating these same little bubbles, these same little spheres. That's really no different to before. We still create those same tribes in that same way, filtering all the information, except we feel that it's more diverse, but really it's not. You think friends you have on Facebook. I don't get a lot of messages from fundamentalist Christians or anything. It's I don't have a lot of friends like that. Stuff coming in every now and then, but I'm not exposed to it. I don't get a lot of people sending me anti-vax messages, and the exposure that I do get to it is very hyperbolized. It's, in other words, the only stuff that gets through my wall tends to be things from anti-vax groups and these great messages they're putting out there. Very rarely is it going to be from individuals on a very personal level. And so, to really be honest, I don't know how technology at that level is really affecting that that tribal communication and how it's going to continue in the future. It seems on one hand we've got the tools to be able to cross-communicate and sort of build bridges between tribes, but on the other hand, it's almost like we're just reinforcing the walls with the belief that we're actually still hyper-connected with diverse cultures. So jury's out as far as I'm concerned as to where we're going to be going in the next 10 years, 20 years with that sort of stuff.
No, it's amazing how different things can be in 10 or 12 years, because just think about 12 years ago, the towers in New York just fell.
Well, that's it. But I think we've got to be aware, I guess, of how it is changing. We tend to be quite blind to those things. A lot of people think, well, I'll just jump on Google and I can look stuff up without thinking about how stuff is actually selected for them. So technology is becoming so black box, so magical in many ways that we're almost oblivious to exactly what it is that is shaping our world, what shapes our communication. We're just as oblivious to how our brains shape it, but now we've got technology on top of it that's so complex that we don't stop and really think about it, and we just blindly go along assuming that we've got the answers to these things. And I fear in some ways that that's just going to get more difficult as we go along. We're still going to get technology that's so tricky to grasp that few people will be able to understand it, and we'll have a lot of people who will just simply think, who'll be living, I guess, very much in their bubble and their little echo chamber, and not really knowing how to make a difference. How do you actually communicate those values you want to get out there? How do you make use of those tools that you don't understand fully to begin with? Luckily, a lot of friends I have are very tech savvy. They do understand a lot of those things, but I sort of think, well, if I've got a lot of tech-savvy friends, I know a lot of people out there who don't. A lot of family members in that who will quite happily use Facebook or quite happily use Twitter or use Google to find stuff, who have no idea how any of that stuff sort of works. How do you set up your privacy measures? How do you have that information filtered towards you? And communicating that, I think, is just another level of complexity that we're going to in the future to be able to actually get the best out of communication and get the best out of our tribal minds, I guess.
Well, yeah. What the new challenges will be once they implant the internet chip in everybody's brain?
Yeah, transhumanism is a funny one with that. The whole where are we going to be when we're no longer human? And it goes back to what I was saying before. I guess the limitations of human thinking. This brain we've evolved with. In a way, we kind of see where we want to go. But that in itself is still a value. A lot of people value actually becoming transhuman. They actually want to go beyond what it is we've evolved to become, and that's fine. But a lot of others aren't. One of my favorite authors is a guy called Greg Egan. He's an Australian science fiction writer, and there's a book here called Diaspora, which sort of has different forms of transhumans. You've got those who've been uploaded into the singularity, into the machine. Then you've got these other humans that are sort of existing in Gleisners or robots. And then you've got the fleshers, who are like your hyper-evolved humans, but they still exist in a biological form. And I love thinking about that book just in terms of where the future of humanity is going to go, and at what point will we still refer to something as being human, and where are you going to blur the lines between artificial intelligence? And it's so far in the future, it's one of those things that is more fantasy and sci-fi than really thinking, oh, I need to start preparing for this. But in other ways, it does actually create a little bit of a wall to bounce ideas off and sort of think, well, the fact we do have brains that evolved the way that they did, they aren't enlightened, perfect beings. It's just we've got brains that evolved to do a particular thing. So how do we use that, I guess, in a way, until we actually get to a point that we can then say, well, we don't want to be that anymore. We want to think differently. And then what do we lose in that respect? So, what defines us as humans, I guess, as well, in terms of the tolerance that we express towards other communities and other tribes? And, what point do we draw the line between somebody having a belief and somebody actually using that belief in a way to suppress others? And, by the same token, at what point do I define my identity by certain beliefs I hold? At what point do I get offended simply because somebody doesn't belong to my tribe? And I think there are a lot of questions there that are important for us as science communicators to be asking and thinking, why am I communicating this? What I want out of my community? And one thing I do tend to find is sometimes we think all those people in our tribe who are doing the same thing we're doing are actually doing a whole lot of different things. They're communicating for different reasons. They're communicating different sets of values. And I think those questions to ask of ourselves can be really quite important ones.
I always find it interesting to roam around places like YouTube and look at the videos that people who have belief systems or value systems that are in a opposition to yours and see how they think. And they're so different. And it's sometimes you sit there and watching it going, I can't believe this is actually people. Do people know about this? And and it's very unsettling, but yet it's something that almost everybody should do, because lots of people, you don't realize every day when you walk by people that you are friendly to one-on-one, and you don't realize that if you knew how they thought, you might not even think you would ever say hi to them. And it's really interesting. And I think that's one of the things you can actually take away as a all-encompassing idea of your book, hence the name.
It's one of the things that one of my pet hates is when people say, well, everyone chooses their belief, or everyone's sort of, you can always choose the beliefs you have, sort of thing. I hate it because there's no greater nonsense than that. We don't choose the beliefs. You can't choose to, if I said right now, well, just choose to stop believing that, the earth goes around the sun or something like that, you'd go, well, I could pretend, I could put the idea in my head. You can't choose to stop believing that. There are so many things you can't choose to believe, or you can't choose to stop believing. Beliefs are the product of a whole lot of little things, your experiences, your culture, your background, your values, all those things come together. That epistemology, that belief formation program that basically has evolved in your head and will continue to evolve. That's what produces beliefs. So you do come across some things that, according to your own epistemology, your own belief formation system, you'll apply that to seeing something, you'll just go, man, crazy. How the hell can people actually believe that Bill Clinton is actually a reptilian or something like that? That's just nuts. And it does. It's like, look, but you have to think the way that you've arrived at that conclusion is because you've got this whole structure of assessment tools. This way of evaluating an idea in your head, automatically apply it. And you go, well, that doesn't actually click with all these things that I believe about the universe, that has to do with evolution and humans and aliens and all this stuff that I'm already bringing to this, takes this observation of a YouTube clip and goes, that's pretty whack. That's just out there. And you think, well, how the hell could someone actually come to that conclusion? And look, I do this as well. I'll sit there and look at it and go, God, they just have to be, and I'll dismiss it. They have to be crazy. Well, now I've just basically medicalized it. I've just said some sort of a medical deficiency, or their brain is not working at the higher level that mine is. Of course, that's nonsense. We dismiss it by saying they must be insane or crazy, but really there's no indication that they have to have some variation in their brain that is that deficient. But you have to have some pretty strong evidence to say that it's working at a deficient level or something. So there must be some other that they've actually got these beliefs, and that's where it does come down to. It comes down to that background of all these little ways of evaluating information that have come together in this instance that produces a belief. And I think it's a fascinating thing when we start to look at how we develop beliefs socially and culturally, and then think, how can I influence that? How can I change that? And the point of changing that is not going to be at the end where someone has developed that belief. They've already applied that epistemology. They've already got that philosophy in place. So going out there and trying to say, no, this is misinformation, it's all wrong, or it's nonsense, or ridiculing it or mocking it in some way, so people then go, well, shit, I'm not going to believe in that because if other people then mock me, or maybe I shouldn't. We have to go right back earlier and basically say, how can I get those thinking values in place much earlier so then people already feel as if they can critically evaluate something. They can change their mind. If they come to a conclusion that's wrong, they've already got a value in place to go, well, actually, maybe I don't have that right. Here's some other ways of thinking about it. And I think sometimes we focus so much at the end there when these, with trying to change the product, that we forget that it was a process there to begin with. And we have to go right back to that and say, how can we start early and getting these, not the ideas out there. I don't want to tell people what to think, but giving them those tools so then when they come to a wrong conclusion later, or a conclusion I feel is wrong, they are open to changing that conclusion because there's other ideas that are put out there and they know how to evaluate them. And I think once we start to do that a lot better, then we're not going to be getting rid of crazy ideas, but it does mean that we can actually discuss them and people can change their minds and go, actually, your idea about Bill Clinton not being a reptilian, that sounds a lot more sane than what I was thinking.
Well, it's very true. And the funny part is, I think I think that people in general have a very odd view of people who change their minds. Look at politics. They always say, he's a flip-flopper. Wouldn't you want that?
Yep. No, look, that's... Yeah, and that's right at the core of what I can't stand as well. It is actually seen as the opposite of a value. It's the worst thing to basically do is to say, actually, I had it wrong all along. And worse still, someone who goes backwards and forwards. And I think that's one of the things I tried to communicate to my students when I taught, is saying, the one thing every student knew that I said a lot of, and that was dare to be wrong. In my class, it is encouraged for you to be wrong. Because in the very least, if you're putting an idea out there and I go, oh, that's not quite right, but I can see where you got that idea from. I can see where you're coming from. Thank you for at least daring to put that information out there, because we can deal with that. We can then take an idea and go, wow, that's a really cool way of thinking about it. No, you haven't quite got the right idea. Here's some other ideas to think about. Here's some more observations for you to start incorporating into your process. You might come to a different conclusion then. And then the student might think about it and go, oh, I didn't actually understand that before, but now I do. Oh, my conclusion's different. But you're right. We've almost got this system in place, this culture that kind of says you have to be right. You have to be right the first time. And if you have an answer that is different, then there's something that you'll be punished for. You'll be looked down upon. So a politician will stand up and go, yeah, I didn't quite have that right before. I've changed my mind. And they'll be questioned. We can see examples where that doesn't happen, obviously. I mean, you had Obama come out recently and basically say, yeah, I know I was talking about same-sex marriage like this before, but here's my position now. It's a little bit different. And people are actually praising that. And I think...
Yeah, half and half.
Well, I mean, the fact that you have people praising it is probably the better way of putting it. I think that is what should be celebrated there, as much as the fact that he's come out in favor of same-sex marriage. The very fact that he said, yeah, you know what, I've actually got a different idea now. We should be flying that flag. We should be saying this is a good thing that we had in the world a prominent figure stand up and go, I had it wrong. Here's my new idea. And that's, I think that's really quite a good thing that we don't celebrate enough. Whether it's in science or politics, it's one of those things that needs to be there at the front of every child's mind as they're growing up, is kind of saying they want to have the ability to go, I didn't have that right before. Here's my idea now. And if they still have it wrong, fine-tune it again. Go, oh, I didn't quite have it right there before. And that's a good thing to say, I can always change my mind with new evidence coming to light.
Dare to improve.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
It's one of those things. It's odd when you think about the fact that as a general rule in society, improving really is looked down upon when you think about it.
Yeah, I think it's linked in a little bit with that. One of the main struggles we have in psychom is the sense of comfort and certainty. People love to have certainty. The very idea that people use science as a system of proof. There's another quirk, I guess, in science philosophy where science doesn't deal with proof. If you want proof, go to maths, go to logic. You can easily set up a mathematical proof for something because there is a structure there you look at to say, well, I know what the premises are, I know how they operate together, they come out with this conclusion, there is your proof. Science is a system of increasing the level of confidence you have in an idea. And yet we don't use it that way. We'll say science proved this or there was proof in it. No, nothing about science about proof. It's all about how confident are you that that idea there has some sort of a reflection of reality, or how's it going to be pragmatically used, something along those lines. And yet we strive for that concept of being certain in things. We want to have something that is absolutely true. And I think that's one of the issues we have in skepticism, I think, is there are two ways that we see skepticism. There's the way that a lot of skeptics see it, and that is the concept of doubt, at least in a skeptical sense, is provisional. So in other words, you always have a sense of doubt there that is just waiting for the possibility of new evidence coming to light. And yet most people don't see skepticism as being about provisional doubt. They see it about pragmatic or practical doubt. In other words, doubt that is going to change your mind on something. So if you doubt something, you will behave differently. I doubt there's any milk down the shop. Well, I'm not going to go down there and find out. I won't leave my house. Or I doubt that the sun is out. Well, I'll take my umbrella and I'll go for a walk. And that's how most people skepticism. Skeptics are people who practically doubt. They actually have that doubt influence their behavior. And yet that's not what science is. Science is about the other one. It's about that provisional doubt. It's basically saying, look, I've always got in my mind that possibility that I could have new evidence that could change my mind on something. And so it's that falling short of certainty, but it doesn't change your behavior. I might have provisional doubt about the fact that it's raining outside. I'm looking out there, I can't see any, so, I won't take an umbrella. But, damn it, if I walk out there and I start getting wet, then, I'm not going to deny the fact it's raining. And it's that difference between that provisional and pragmatic doubt in terms of the two forms of skepticism is something I think it could be quite a useful tool for people to understand.
And I think that's where a lot of, I don't say arguments, but a lot of the conflict that you see in skeptical communication comes from, where you have that divided fence about, well, we can talk bad about these people because we know they're wrong, but these people we're not sure about, so we give them a pass for everything they want to talk about. And it's funny because to me, I would like to treat everything the same. And if you're going to say that Sylvia Browne is crazy, then you have to then say that every preacher is also crazy, because they have about the same level of proof that each other have. So at one point, the points of skeptics tend to be on those weird dividing lines in that level of doubt. And I think it's a weird place we're in once that the umbrella of skepticism has gotten this big, that you actually see these things coming out and exposed. And I think that's a big issue. Absolutely. We've got, but again, it's kind of, once again, how the brain operates in that tribal sort of sense. You think about how you determine what constitutes evidence for an idea. There's a lot of little shortcuts that we use, just simply for the fact that it's useful. We can't go around every single idea that comes up, evaluating in a purely scientific sense. So you tend to rely on people who seem to share the same values you do.
And that means a lot of people get a free pass. It's quite easy when you've got somebody that you admire, that you respect, coming out with a certain idea, and you go, well, I admire them and respect them, and they seem to have the same sort of philosophy I do, and their ideas are going to seem a little more appealing. So already you've got a bias there. You can't not do that. It's one of those things that you can think about it, you can constantly try to critically analyze everything, and it's a good thing to try to do, but we're going to get it wrong. And again, it's one of those things that I feel I do. I can sense myself doing it. I'll be listening to somebody on TV and go, oh, I kind of like that guy. I like that politician. Or, they seem like one of my kind of people. And they'll say something, and I won't be giving it, the full going over of critical analysis. It'll just wash over me, and I'll tend to pick it up. And then somebody else who I'll think is a complete nutter, the leader of the opposition or something will come out and say something, and I'll be ranting at the TV about it, thinking, God, what an idiot. Simply because I'm already primed to say that individual is not of my kind. They're not my tribe. They're not my people. And so I will be a lot more antagonistic towards the ideas they put forward. And it takes a lot of effort, I think, to not do that. And so sometimes it means if something is important, if it's going to be something that I actually feel subscribes to my values of my well-being or my health or my family's health, or our economical situation, or all that sort of stuff. It's one of those things I feel then I will stop and I'll start to really think critically about it and say, I need to have a good answer to this. I need to be able to make really clear, good decisions. And I think that's where the whole critical thinking thing comes down to it, is we can't think critically about everything. What we can do is have a bit of an idea in mind on those things that are important to be thinking critically about, and really start thinking about them and say, look, I might like this person. They might be part of my tribe or part of my group. But the information they give me is really going to be, it's going to have pretty heavy consequences if I apply it and it's wrong. And I think that's part of that whole, how do you get out there and communicate to people? Look, there are some decisions you're going to be making in life. I think it'd be really important for you, for other people in your community, for other people in your family. They're the ones that you really need to step back and say, look, how do I get past this tribal thinking? And how do I then evaluate the information that's coming for them, regardless of whether I really like them or whether I really think that they're complete assholes? And how do I actually use that information in a way that is going to give me what I want? Because we've got a lot going against us in how the brains work in the first place.
We have flaws. You can't get around them, so sometimes you have to learn how to deal with them.
Yeah, I prefer not to call them flaws, though. Flaws almost makes it feel as if, again, there's that enlightened state. And, one of the things that keeps coming to mind with a lot of this is how heavy our language is that we use, how value-laden it is. One thing that is really difficult when you discuss evolution, and as someone who writes a lot for kids on topics of evolution, how much language is teleological? So how much is directed? They evolved to do blah. So polar bears evolved to survive in the Arctic. No, they didn't. There was a selective process that went on that basically meant those polar bears that could survive, with their random traits that they got, did a little bit better. There's no teleology involved in it, but our language already lends itself to that. And I think a lot of the language that we use to describe a lot of the things that in science or how our brain works, so we think about flaws, I think it's a hard thing to actually pick the right words to use in there, because I understand exactly what you're meaning by it. And yet I sometimes have to force myself and go, they're not flaws, really. They mightn't help us in one regard, but don't forget they evolved for, in a very specific context with so long that what we see as a flaw wasn't really, a bad thing at all. We have to say it's a flaw in regards to certain outcomes. So, the brain evolved to suit particular needs. And in some contexts, those flaws actually were quite useful. That binding together in tribes, being able to empathize and relate to other people within a hierarchy and all that was actually quite useful for so long. But we have a far more complicated world now, where we've got a need, I think, to actually work together with diverse groups who aren't all part of our same culture. That's where it starts to become a bit of an impediment. That's when we can, I think about it in a little bit as a bit of a flaw. How do we work around that? And that's going to have to be one of our goals, I think.
So, where can people find your stuff, things about you? Are you going to be out touring with this book? Anything like that?
I did a bit of touring around Australia when it came out here in March 2011, I think it was. It's 2012 now. So it's just come out in the US. I'd love to be able to come out to the US soon to be able to do some talks and meet and greet people. But unfortunately, that's probably going to have to wait for another year or so. Fortunately, my partner is from California, so we've got family over there, and I will make it over. In Australia, you can actually see my stuff if you have kids and you actually want to sign them up to the Double Helix Club. We've got a couple of magazines, so that's all part of the CSIRO's education group, and I have a lot to do with them. Otherwise, in the near future, I will be doing a little bit more touring, especially as I do some more work, doing some lectures around the place. Probably one of the other things that I encourage people, like the Australian government, not so long ago, produced a series of clips on critical thinking. They're actually putting out a module for secondary school students, early secondary school students, in critical thinking and logic that I wrote and helped produce that. And that's through the Australian Department of Innovation. So there's been some of those clips that have gone around. I think Phil Plady actually had them on about astronomy. They've been on IO9, so they've been doing the tour around. 6 video clips on critical thinking, and hopefully in the near future there may be a few more of those coming out, but I can't say too much about that at this stage.
And that was the Australian government that put those together?
That's right, the Australian Department of Innovation, Industry Innovation, Science, and it's now responsible for tertiary education. So, it was one of the government departments, was responsible for communicating technology to the community, and one of the things I felt was quite important to do was to actually promote good thinking, good science thinking skills, so critical thinking, understanding how logical fallacies, how they work. And I absolutely applaud that. I think we need more of that sort of thing out in the community to encourage, not so much saying, look, you need to be taking this technology up, this is all good stuff. But as I was saying before, is to encourage that level of discussion and say, for a government to actually get the best out of its community, they need to be able to engage with that conversation. And I think that those tools actually do that. So I do hope to be seeing them produce more of that in the future. I
wish the government here would do the same thing.
Yeah, well, it's a good thing that they've actually done that and that they're on the internet, because that means that people all over the planet can be downloading and using those clips and hopefully the module in their own classrooms and their own schools. And just purely by having the Australian government produce it, hopefully it'll be a benefit to other countries.
Another benefit of the internet.
Absolutely.
So that's great. So I'll have a link to your book, Tribal Science, in the show notes, and links to everything we just talked about. Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No worries. Thanks, Derek.
I once again thank Mike for coming on Skepticality, especially with our time difference. As usual, the things discussed here and all previous episodes of Skepticality are on our website at skepticality.com.
Hungry for more skepticism? Want to learn the truth about the scientific controversies of our time? Then subscribe to Skeptic, the quarterly magazine Stephen Jay Gould called the best journal in the field. To subscribe, visit skeptic.com today.